Today is May 31st, 2024. We are interviewing Agnes Solomon. I'm the interviewer, Catherine Finley, and we are in the Bronx, New York, USA. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. Can you introduce yourself for us today?
Hi, my name is Agnes Solomon. My maiden name was Feuerstein.
Can you spell your first and last names for us?
Agnes Solomon.
And your name at birth, you said, was
Feuerstein. Feuerstein.
Did you have any other names at birth?
Actually, I had a Jewish name, and my Jewish name is Liebe.
How do you spell that?
Liebe.
And Agnes, when were you born?
I was born on July 25th, 1938.
And if you're willing to say, how old are you today?
Well, today I'm just about a month or so away from my 86th birthday.
Very good. What was the name of the town where you were born?
I was actually born in Cluj, that is in Transylvania, Romania now, and I never lived there. We lived in a very small town called Târnăveni in Romanian. In Hungarian, the name is Dicsőszentmárton. And we lived there until I was about 7 years old.
How do you spell the name of that town?
There is a sound that cannot be reproduced. Tarneveni. It's pronounced Târnăveni.
Great, thank you. And how do you spell the name of Cluj?
Cluj.
Great, thank you. The town where you were born, was it near any large cities?
So the town where I was born was a fairly large city, and Târnăveni was, I don't think it was too far from there. I don't have an exact sense of distances. I was very young when I lived there, and we didn't have cars, so everything seemed to be far away.
Do you recall what your mother's name was?
My mother's name was Clara, Clara, and her maiden name was Deutsch, Deutsch.
Where was she born?
She was born in Târgu Mureș, I think. I don't know for sure. I think in Târgu Mureș, which is all in Transylvania, and my family on both sides was from Transylvania, which is a region that now belongs to Romania, but over the centuries it changed hands between Hungarians and Romanians, and there is a mixed population of Hungarians and Romanians.
What would you say your mother's nationality or ethnicity, religion was?
So we were always Jewish, and both families lived in Transylvania, And so we never considered ourselves Romanians or Hungarians. We always considered ourselves Jewish, period. And we always felt that we were unwanted in the country.
Can you give me some examples of why you and your family may have felt that way?
So there was a lot of anti-Semitism, and we were faced with it every day, basically. And so while we were in Romania, we were always thinking of leaving. That was the main thing, and we always knew we were not going to stay there, but we didn't know how and when we would be able to leave. And when I lived in Transylvania, in addition to being Jewish, we were also Hungarian speaking at home, and that was another layer of discrimination. For example, as a very young child, I had a white dress with red strawberries with green leaves, and one of the policemen saw us on the street and objected to this choice of colors, which are the colors of the Hungarian flag. So my mother had to go home and change the green leaves to yellow leaves, which did not look so good. And they were graffiti. There was always graffiti on the walls saying Jews, no, actually it said kikes to Palestine. So this was a daily reminder that we didn't belong there.
Was the graffiti on the walls of your house or around town?
No, it was around town, and it was a known fact that we were not desirable.
Growing up, do you remember what your mom's family was like? Did you see them often?
Right. So my mother's family lived in a different town, not so big. We used to go and visit them, first by bus, then by carriage, and so I know my grandmother. I remember her well. And my grandfather died when I was very young, so I don't remember much about him. They had a dry goods business in town, which was confiscated during the Nazis. And so this was taken, and also their home was taken. So they had to move to a not such a nice neighborhood. And they lost the business completely. And my grandfather died early during this persecution in the early years. He had a heart condition, and this really didn't help. And my grandmother, I remember her very well. She was a wonderful cook and a wonderful baker, and a very special person. She was orphaned at the age of 8. By the age of 8, she had lost her older sister and her mother to TB. So she was left with a younger brother. Her older brothers moved away already. They were grown. One of them died in World War I. The other one died of cancer later on. Anyway, so my grandmother grew up to be, she had a very bad stepmother, so she grew up to be a very strong person.
What was her name?
Her name was Regina.
And do you know her last name?
Her maiden name was Fischer, and her last name was my grandfather's name, of course, which was Deutsch. And I don't remember very much about him. I remember the store, and I remember, him being very loving. And I was the first grandchild in the family, so everything was like a miracle, whatever I did.
What was your grandfather's name?
Alexander.
And did they also speak Hungarian?
Yes, everybody spoke Hungarian.
Okay. And also Jewish?
You mean, did they speak Yiddish?
No,
They
would
were
you
all
say that they
Jewish.
also identified?
Yes, yes.
Okay. And do you have, it sounds like you have lots of strong memories of your grandparents, particularly your grandmother. What types of things would she bake? Do you remember
Oh, she
her
basically,
baking? And
it was all Hungarian food. So strudel was a production because she made the strudel dough by hand, which involved a whole complicated process. And I used to watch her cook. Yes.
do you have any favorite memories growing up of your mother?
Yes, yes. So my mother was a very good mother. You couldn't ask for a better mother. And thinking of her children, putting them first. And so my memories of my mother actually are the things that I learned from her, which is she was very honest, very open, and she was a hard-working person. So I learned from her to do a good job. Whatever I was doing when I worked, I always tried to do it as well as I could. And I think the idea of being authentic is something I learned from her, and I also taught my own daughters.
Great. How about we talk a little bit about your father? What was his name again?
His name was Simon Feuerstein, and my father had a lot of brothers and sisters. His father's name was Jacob, and his mother's name was Yolanda. And his father was an important person in the Jewish community. He was very religious, very observant. And so my father went to Hebrew school and never attended any other school. However, his sisters were allowed to go to school and do whatever they wanted. And some of them went to college, some of them chose professions. One of them became a photographer, one was a chemist, a pharmacist, the other one was a teacher. And my grandmother, my father's mother, got married when she was 15. So she had 11 children, 9 of which survived. And by the time I met her, she was in her 70s, which was considered very old in those days. And she was sort of retired from housework. And I remember her. I actually have a picture of her, which I'm going to show later.
Wonderful. Do you recall where in order your father was born of all of the kids?
Yes, she was the one before the last.
Okay, your dad was.
My dad was the youngest son, and
Okay.
he only had one younger sibling, a sister.
Okay. And did he and your grandparents also speak Hungarian?
Yes.
Okay. And do you know what town or city or village your grandparents lived in?
Yes, they lived in Gerla, and we visited them too, but they were farther away than my other grandmother. But I remember the visits, especially because one of my father's sisters had a lamb and rabbits, and so I remember the lamb and the rabbits, and I remember the, you know, how children maybe don't remember events so much or don't understand events so much as they get a feel for the atmosphere, for how the other people feel. So I felt it was a very loving family.
How do you spell Gerla? Do you know?
Gherla. In Hungarian, it's Szamosújvár. That's another spelling.
Okay.
Yes.
Do you know how you would spell that
Yes.
in English?
SZAMOSUJB, as in Victor, AR, Szamosújvár. The Szamos is a river, so it was on the river.
Okay. Beautiful. You mentioned that your grandfather Jacob was very religious, and very
Right.
observant in
Yes.
the community. Do you know if they experienced anti-Semitism as well, like you described your family did?
Of course, but in addition to experiencing anti-Semitism, except for my grandfather who died earlier, my grandmother and 5 sisters and 2 of my father's brothers perished in concentration camps.
And do you know the history or the year, perhaps in which they were taken away from their home?
I don't know the exact year, but that part of Hungary, that part of Transylvania was part of Hungary. So the Hungarians deported the Jews very enthusiastically, I have to say. And so people were rounded up, put in cattle cars, and taken to concentration camps. I know my grandmother and my father's sisters, except for 2 actually, we know that they went to Auschwitz, and I think they went to the gas chambers. I remember my father and my mother receiving a postcard which one of the sisters wrote. And in the postcard it said that we have arrived to the camp and we are fine and we're going to go to work here, and now we're getting ready for the showers. And the showers, we know what they were, right? The gas chamber, really. And I remember my parents looking at this postcard and turning it this way and that way and looking at the stamp. And my father saying, when he read, we're going to work, and he said, would it just be so? And that was that. Now, 2 of his sisters lived in another town, different towns. And the one of them was a pharmacist. She never came back. And, when people came back from concentration camps, they usually went back to the same town where they used to live. And so they started telling stories about how each person perished or how they survived. And in this case, we found out from them. So one of the sisters, who was a pharmacist, simply nobody knew what happened to her. The sisters, initially the ones who went to Auschwitz, they always wanted to be together and they wanted to be with the mother. So that was that. The youngest sister was a teacher and she lived in a different town. And so the story is that I think she was in Bergen-Belsen, and she was an educated person. Probably she spoke German quite well. So she was put in charge with her barracks. People came back to say how nice she was and how she tried to protect them. And one day, they were rounded up, as usually. They had to stand in line, and the Germans were looking for women with small hands and beautiful eyes. And she had very small hands. She was petite, she had small hands, and she had beautiful violet eyes. So she knew she was going to be picked. She tried to run away, and she was beaten to death.
What was her name, Agnes?
Her name was Nelly.
And her
real name was Cornelia. But we called her Nelly, and the last name was Feuerstein.
Do you remember the names of your other aunts and uncles?
Right. So there was Ethel. She was the oldest one who took over the housekeeping. There was Malvina, Barbara. There was Laura. And then there was Nelly, so 5. And the brothers were Alexander and Kalman. One brother, Armin, lived in the same town where we lived. So he escaped the concentration camp.
And how do you spell his name?
Armin.
Was your father close to his siblings, or some of them?
Very close, especially to his younger sister.
And what was his younger sister's name?
The younger sister is the one whose story I told. Her name was Nelly.
Yeah, Nelly. Do you have any strong memories of your father when you were little?
Yes. So my family, before the war and during the war, we were very kosher. We observed Shabbat. There was a goose every Friday, Saturday. And we observed Shabbat and the holidays. I remember Passover, and you had to find the matzah, which was my favorite holiday, really. And my father used to go to the temple, and he used to take me to the temple. My father, or the men in my family on that side, they were all Cohen. So sometimes he had to do special things in the temple. But I used to sit with the men, and I went with him. He took me just because, I was quiet and didn't bother anybody. And he liked to take me for a walk. In small towns, there's always a main street, so we would walk on the main street and meet and greet people.
Did you like going to temple with him?
Yes. And my father, my father was a smoker. So, and he owned a lumber yard when we lived in this small town. And the lumberyard and the house where we lived were like back to back, connected by some kind of a yard with trees and stuff. So he used to come home for lunch, and he used to, no big deal, come home. When he came home, I used to sit on his lap, and he used to entertain me by singing and by blowing smoke rings, which now we know was not a good thing to do. But yeah, he was around all the time, really.
Yeah. Did you have any siblings growing up?
Did I have anyone?
Siblings.
Siblings? No, my brother was born after the war.
Okay. Okay, and what was your brother's name?
My brother's name is Alexander.
And do you know what date of birth?
July 23rd, 1946.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
1946, yeah. Our birthdays are, we celebrate together.
Very close. Yeah,
He was he was my birthday present. My parents asked me if I wanted a bicycle or a brother, and I said I wanted a brother. And there he was.
And where was your brother born?
He was born in Târgu Mureș. That's another town in Transylvania.
How do you spell that?
Targu, one word, Târgu. Mureș, Mures. So the Mureș is another river. Every river had this town. Even Târnăveni, there was a river, Târnava.
What was the landscape like where you grew up? Was it?
It was
sounds like there were rivers.
beautiful. I mean, Romania is a beautiful country, and Transylvania is beautiful with hills and mountains and vegetation. And Romania is a very rich country. They have a lot of agriculture, and they have gold mines and salt mines and uranium and oil. During the war, we had American soldiers in this town where the refineries were. They bombed the refineries because the Germans were using the oil. So it was a strategic place.
When you were growing up, did you spend a lot of time outside?
Yes. Yes. Sometimes my mother...
Any special memories?
Yeah, sometimes my mother used to take me for walks, and there was a beautiful alley with chestnut trees, and when they bloomed, I don't know if you've seen any chestnut trees bloom, they're like pyramids and smelled wonderful. So we would go, and then we would walk around the river. Yeah, it was very nice. My mother was a walker, and that's another thing I inherited from her.
You like to walk?
I like to walk.
Yeah. Do you know how your parents met?
Yes, this was a funny story. My father's sister, this youngest sister, married my grandfather's, on my mother's side, business partner. So there was a wedding in Târnăveni. Why there, I don't know. But that's where it was. And my mother and her family traveled by train to Târnăveni. And there was a wedding, and that's where they met. Now, in the big upheaval of travel, one suitcase got forgotten in Târnăveni. So my father volunteered, offered to find the suitcase, and he did. And so they kept in touch about the suitcase for a while. And then finally the suitcase arrived and he brought the suitcase. And that's how they met. Then he came back a few more times.
Was the missing suitcase, did it belong to your mother?
I don't know, it belonged to the family, somebody in the family.
Okay, okay. Very nice. Can you describe the home that you grew up in? Can you describe that in detail for us?
Yes, so in this small town, Târnăveni, we did not own a house. We rented the house from our Hungarian neighbors. And it was a very simple house, just ground floor, that was it. We had, I think we had 3 rooms, one large kitchen and 2 other rooms, one of them the bedroom, the other one like a dining room, living room, whatever. So there was no plumbing, there was no electricity, no, obviously, no sanitation. And, we had a well somewhere in the yard, and you had to bring water from the well. So the lighting was, and the cooking was done with gas, because Romania has a lot of natural gas, and everything was gas. So we have gas lighting. Not gas lighting, gas lighting.
Did you live in that home with your parents?
So I lived there with my parents until the authorities decided that we had too much room and too many rooms. And they moved in a sergeant and his entire family into one of our rooms. So the sergeant and his wife and something like 6 children lived and cooked in this one room. And the oldest girl was 13 years old, and the youngest one was a baby. So you can imagine the noise and everything, but they were nice people, very nice people, very respectful, and I learned Romanian from them perfectly. And so for me, it was fun, because as an only child I was bored, and now I had people to play with. Unfortunately, they came with bed bugs, and it took a while, but the bed bugs found their way to our side of the wall, and then it was terrible, and that was it. My mother said, we have to move. So after this place, very modest place where we lived, really, we moved to a mansion. The mansion didn't belong to us either. It belonged to the local aristocrats, a couple. They were Grof. I don't know I can't translate this title in English. But anyway, they had a mansion with a park, surrounded by a park and everything. But during the war, all the men were gone to war, and there was nobody to work the fields. So basically, they had no money. And they accepted us as tenants, and then it was a more comfortable life. We had electricity, we had plumbing, the piano came with my mother, and it was very nice living there, obviously. And the lady was very impressed with my mother and recommended us as tenants later on when we moved to Bucharest. So they maintained the personnel, but and my mother shared the kitchen, so she could see what they were eating. They were eating mashed potatoes, but it was served with a cart, wheeled in with a cart, with a silver platter, with a silver dome, and served like this. So I think they were very happy to have us there because it was like a nice source of income for them.
Was it common in your area that you grew up in for Jewish families to rent homes and not be able to buy?
I don't know. We never bought anything, any home, because we always had the idea that we were going to leave. So we always rented.
Yeah. How would you describe your family's economic status when you were younger?
My father was a good businessman. He was an excellent accountant and a very smart and pleasant person. And he did well with his lumberyard, so I never felt that we were lacking anything. Sometimes when I went on walks with my mother, she used to show me the nicer parts of town, the nicer houses, but I never felt deprived in any way. Not until the communists came. Then there was another story.
And we'll talk about that in a moment.
Right.
I guess the home that you grew up in, what you mentioned, the sergeant and his family then moved into, was that in a neighborhood where there were other Jewish families around? What was the
I don't think there were
community
many.
or neighborhood?
I don't think there were any Jewish families close by. My parents had Jewish friends, of course, and they came to visit, but it was a distance away. What we had next door was this Hungarian family. They were very nice people, and we got along very well with them. But what happened one day, I was playing like in front of the house, and the little boy came, and we started playing together, and we had a wonderful time. But I didn't understand a word of what he was saying, and he didn't understand what I was saying. This was before the sergeant moved in. But we had a great time, and we understood each other without words, and we laughed, and it was great. So he asked me to come to his house, again without words, but I understand. I went to his house, and I was in his garden, and all of a sudden his mother came out, and she was very angry with me, and it didn't make any sense to me. I think I might have been 4 or 5 years old, I don't know, because I didn't think I did anything wrong or there was anything wrong with me. But she basically told me to leave, and then she yelled at the little boy too. So as I was about to leave, my mother probably realized what happened, and she was already coming, and there were some sharp words exchanged and insults, I'm sure. And so my mother took me home, and she said, "Don't go there anymore." Some time passed, and I never went there. But one day the little boy came out again, and he showed me that he had a gun. It wasn't a real gun. It was a toy gun that worked with a cork. So basically it was compressed air, and you pressed the trigger, and the cork popped out, and it was on a string, so you could put it back. And he said to me, "Hold out your hand." So I held out my hand, and he put the gun into my hand, and then he pulled the trigger, and the cork came out, and it was quite painful. And I could see his face when I started crying. His face, like for a fleeting moment, his face expressed some regret, but then he started laughing. So I'm telling this story because this is how hate is being passed from one generation to the next. And that's what happened, experienced firsthand.
Do you feel like this family, neighbors in the place where you grew up, why do you think they treated you and your family this way?
Just because we were Jewish, we didn't even know them.
Did you, apart from synagogue, did you have any other type of Jewish community centers or theaters
There was
nearby?
no community center. We, like I said, we only had Jewish friends, and this was the situation everywhere during the war, that even people who, let's say, felt neutral about Jews would not socialize with them because it would be damaging to their own reputation.
Do you remember approximately how old you were when the sergeant and his family moved in to your house?
I remember that my sixth birthday was already in the mansion. So it was before I was 6 years old, maybe five and a half.
And you mentioned it was the authorities came. Who were these people, and who was this sergeant? Where did he work?
The sergeant was just a sergeant. He was not an important person. Why they put him in a, I don't know, maybe he was from a village or who knows. But they put him there. The authorities were Romanian authorities, the police, everybody, the mayor, everybody was Romanian, and Romanians had their own Iron Guard and their own persecution of Jews. We were lucky, really. So just to, thinking in sequence, we were still in this house, and I was very young. I must have been very young because I could talk, but I mispronounced certain words. So the authorities came, and they put seals on the house, and they rounded us up. So they put a seal on my crib. They put a seal on the door. The seal on my crib is something that stuck in my head. And my parents told me we were going on a trip. And my mother, said goodbye to the neighbors. And the neighbors were crying, and my mother was crying, and I was puzzled because usually going on a trip was a happy occasion. But this time, they took us to a place. It was summertime. We were put up in a school, mattresses on the floor, typical refugee style. And the school was like, had a courtyard in the middle. So that was a public space. Otherwise, we were distributed. All the Jews from the region were taken to this town called Dej, D-E-J, and they were put in the school. And so I didn't know, again, I had no idea what was going on, so for me, it was another place, that's all, where there were other children. But everybody was, talking, and as it turned out, we were slated to go to a concentration camp. But whether because the authorities had been bribed or whether because it was too late in the war, I am not sure why. But we were sent back home. So we went back home, and this was a narrow escape.
So this is when World War II was still going on?
Absolutely, yeah. I couldn't have been more than 4 years old, so in 1942 maybe, but I'm not sure about the date.
Mm-hmm. Do you recall, or perhaps your parents told you later, how long you had to stay at this school?
I don't remember how long we were there. It could have been, I don't know, a month or longer. I'm not sure.
And after you left, did you go back to the home that you had been forced to
Yes,
flee?
we were right back,
Yeah.
right there, yes.
Growing up, did you, especially when you were younger, like 5 years old, did you go to kindergarten? Did you attend school in your neighborhood?
I wanted to go to school very badly because partly because I was bored and partly because I used to see the high school kids with these colorful caps that I liked very much. So in Romania in those days, there was no pre-kindergarten and kindergarten. So I was a little young for what was kindergarten there. But my mother insisted, the teacher, one of the teachers, she was friendly with one of the teachers. She insisted that they take me, and she took me to the school. And this kindergarten had benches like in a regular school. 2 benches, you had to sit nice and straight. You had a desk, for what, I don't know. And the one set of kids was against this wall, the other is double. There were double sets of chairs, the other wall. So I didn't want, I was sitting next to the wall. And the way the kindergarten went, we were told to repeat certain poems, children's poems. And then, were called out to be tested or whatever. So when they called me, I didn't want to disturb the kid next to me. And I came out from under the bench, which was a shortcut in my mind. And everybody started laughing, and the teacher was not happy, so they kicked me out of kindergarten. And not having anything better to do, I learned to read by myself.
Do you remember any of the poems from that class?
Yes, but they're in Romanian, so
Any that you wanted to share?
not really. Not worth wasting
Not really.
time with that.
Yeah. So you taught yourself to read.
Yes.
You like to read. What kind of books or stories did you love growing up?
So growing up, I had 2 books. And one was by the Brothers Grimm, and the other one was the Andersen stories. So I had very few toys, but they were very good toys. I had a doll, I had a teddy bear, I had a doll carriage, and I had building blocks and a big green ball. That was it. The big green ball made me very popular with the boys who moved in with the sergeant's family. So they let me kick it once in a while.
Did you have, apart from the sergeant's family, did you have friends in the neighborhood?
There were
Little kids that you played
no
with?
kids in the neighborhood. Our landlady's granddaughter came to visit sometimes. She was about my age. And when I learned to read in Hungarian. For all our books were in Hungarian. And I had these little square books, like children have little square books. It would be cat, and then a picture of the cat, and so on. Except in Hungarian, it's a little more complicated because it's not so phonetic. But anyway, they gave me these books, and every time I took these books, everybody, the adults, remembered that the books had belonged to a little boy, and everybody was like, oh, poor little boy. So obviously, the little boy was taken to concentration camp. and somehow the books got to me.
Did you grow up with these children speaking Hungarian?
Yes. Yes.
And did you happen to go to any type of religious education or school
No.
at synagogue?
No, we went to the synagogue. There was no, I don't know if there was any Jewish school, but certainly not for somebody my age.
Do you remember, you mentioned this white dress that you wore with strawberries on it. Do you remember other types of outfits or clothing that you wore when you were younger?
Yes, so in Romania there were no ready-made clothes. You bought the fabric, took it to a dressmaker, and my mother used to, the dressmakers would have books with pages of dresses, and my mother used to pick the dress, and the dressmaker would make it. Sometimes my mother would pick two dresses and combine them. So I had, I don't know, I like to be nicely dressed. So I had different dresses.
And when your family went to go buy things, was this in town? There was a main street with shops, or what did
there
that
was a
look like?
market. There was a market. You went to the market. We didn't have a refrigerator. In fact, never in Romania we never had a refrigerator. Even when we moved to a big city where there was electricity, we never had a refrigerator. So my mother, my grandmother, everybody went to the market practically every day and came back with whatever they wanted to cook that day. It was a whole thing.
Are there certain meals that your mom would cook that you really remember, that you really enjoyed?
Yes. My favorite was plum dumplings.
Would she pick the plums or buy them at the market?
She bought the plums.
You bought them, yeah. Did you ever help her in the kitchen with cooking?
No. I watched. I didn't help.
Yeah. And would you eat the plum dumplings on special occasions, or that was more of
This was a seasonal thing,
typical
where everything was
seasonal
seasonal, fruit and vegetables in season only, except for apples, which the apples were kept in the cellar. They were wrapped individually in thin paper and put in the cellar. So we had apples pretty much throughout the year.
In terms of your experience as a young child during this time, did you ever daydream or have goals about what you wanted to do or be growing up?
I don't remember having any idea of having a profession when I was at that stage. During the war, the focus was on surviving, and I was very much aware of that. So, thinking of leaving, my parents started learning English just in case, but it was, next year in Jerusalem. So we expected actually to end up in Israel, but it didn't happen. Things didn't go that way.
And so this notion, this idea of having to leave, would you say that was felt for you from a very young age?
Yes. the idea of not belonging, the idea of impermanence, the idea of maybe someday we can have a home where there are no anti-Semites. That was the goal.
Did your parents talk to you often about anti-Semitism or try to teach you, talk to you at home about what was happening in your community at that time, or they just wanted you to be a normal, have a happy childhood?
I'm sure they wanted me to have a happy childhood, but it was so pervasive that you didn't even have to say it. And I remember when my mother had to sew the yellow stars on the coats, on the jackets, and she was so mad.
Did she say anything that you recall when she was mad? Did she?
So again, I don't remember if she said anything, but I remember the feel of that day when she was mad and my father was sort of, okay, we have to do this, we're going to do it.
Do you remember how old you were when that happened?
I must have been very young. I don't remember when it happened, but it must have been at the beginning.
And was it, do you know who it was that told Jews in your community that the stars had to be on clothing? Is it the Romanian authorities?
The authorities were Romanian authorities in that part of the Transylvania. The northern part of Transylvania belonged to Hungary. The rest of it belonged to Romania. So these were Romanian authorities.
Okay.
The thing with the Romanian authorities during the war and forever really, since the Turkish occupation in 1400, the whole country functions, I shouldn't say functions, but it does, functioned, let's put it this way. The country functioned based on bribes and arranging things. So it was all, a matter of, that was the synagogue, I think. The people went to the synagogue to put their heads together, to strategize. Who are they going to bribe? How are they going to go about this or that? What's happening? So the synagogue was the center of the Jewish life. And at some point, Jews were not allowed to have businesses, which meant that my father was not allowed to have his lumberyard anymore. So that would have left us in pretty bad shape. So his idea was to sell the lumberyard to somebody on paper. And there was a very nice young man in town who was an alcoholic. He was terrible. It was terrible for the family. And they couldn't even afford to live separately for their in-laws. So they lived together, and so my father offered this guy the lumberyard, put it on his name, and the guy he didn't have to do anything at all. My father would pay him every month or every week or whenever. He would go to the house. Actually, I went with him once to the house to give the money to the wife, because otherwise he would drink it all. And that's how we survived. Now, of course, nobody was crazy enough to believe the story, so the authorities had to be bribed. And they were. I remember my father inviting the chief of police, the mayor, all these people to a game of poker. And my mother, for some reason, I remember my mother was making donuts, and they were eating donuts and were very happy. And my father kept losing and losing and losing and laughing because he was actually a very good poker player, but he deliberately lost enough for these people to whatever they have their bribes. And that's how things went on.
And so, did he end up selling the
On
lumber
paper.
yard to this person? On paper.
Yes.
Yeah. And after that happened, did you and your parents continue to live in this area? Or did you?
So
did you
after
have to
that,
move?
after that, the sergeant's family moved in, the story that I told before, and we moved out of the area, and we lived not for very long, maybe a year and something, in this beautiful place.
The mashed potatoes on the silver platter. And after you lived at this nice home, then where did you go?
So after we lived in this nice home, it came, the war was coming to an end. And my father said that it wasn't safe for us to stay in Transylvania, that all the armies, the Russians going back home, the Germans being taken prisoner, the Italians coming from Greece, all these armies and the Romanians would cross exactly where we were, and we had to go somewhere else. So we had to go somewhere else, and so we did move. We went to Bucharest, and that's a longer story of how we got there.
So when did your family have to move next?
So my father decided that we had to get out of where we were and move south towards Bucharest, to Bucharest actually, where the war seemed to be over already. Bucharest was bombed during the war, but now the war was over in that area, so that's the place where we should go. So we packed a suitcase and put everything in the suitcase that we were going to take, and we took some food, and we went to my grandmother's, my mother's mother, and they had also packed and cooked and did the laundry just like us. So our suitcases, they put them in a cart, I don't know, maybe 4 feet by 3 feet or something like that. Our suitcases, their suitcases, and everybody, all the adults had knapsacks filled with stuff, and the men pulled the cart, and we started walking. And we walked for about a week. The trains were not running, so we had to walk. And we started walking, and I have to say I had a great time because it was interesting. You know, we were in different places. Every night we slept in somebody else's house. As we would get to a village where we decided we could stop, we looked for a room, and somebody was always willing to rent the room overnight. And I thought that was very interesting because I always liked to see how other people lived. And it was funny to see some houses where everything was covered in plastic, and some rooms were open only for guests and special occasions. So we went like this for about a week until we got to a place where the trains were running. On the way there, something very strange happened. As I was looking at the scenery, I noticed a man hanging from a tree, which was a very strange sight. And I said to myself, the man don't belong into the trees. And at the same time, my mother and my aunt horrified, covered their eyes. And my father told me to look at some bird in the other direction, which I did, but I knew that there was something I was better off not looking at, so I didn't insist on that. And on the way there, we also ran into some Romanian soldiers. And I remember my mother saying, oh, they're so young. So we stopped and we exchanged a few words, and they gave us sardines and we gave them homemade cake, and it was all very friendly. A little later, we heard an explosion, and it turned out that as they were crossing a bridge, the Germans bombed the bridge. So they all died. It was kind of a sad story. Now, I should have said something about the alarms. I remember now, when we were in the small town where we were living, there were already alarms that sounded air raids. And so everybody had to go to the cellar, hide in the cellar, and there was one sound when the alarm started, and then when the danger was over, there was a second different sound that you could go back to the house. So for for most people, for the adults, this were very stressful times. Although this was a very small town, the only thing they had was a glass factory at the time. So my mother was always in a panic, and my father was always very calm, and he told me that this is a very big place and the bomb is not going to fall exactly here, which I believed, and which is what happened. I don't think they bombed the town really at all, as far as I know. It wasn't worth bombing, but Bucharest had been bombed. So when we got to Bucharest, after getting on a train at Brașov, this is where trains started running, we got on the train, we got to Bucharest, we saw a lot of houses, a lot of ruins, houses that had been destroyed during the war. So when we got to Bucharest by train, we arrived to the major train station called the North train station, which was modeled after the Paris North train station. Very nice, with a glass dome. And we went to a hotel, and we stayed in a hotel temporarily for a while, not knowing what was going to happen. Then we moved to what it was called pension. The pension was a place where you got a room and you also got meals. And that's when the things started going bad as far as the food was concerned, because there was no food. So it was very bad food. I decided I wasn't going to eat any bad food, so I lost a lot of weight. But, otherwise I was very happy. We lived in this pension. It was in the center of the town. There was a park nearby. And my mother, for the first time, she had no kitchen to cook in and no house to clean. So she spent her time with me, which, from my point of view, was the best arrangement. And so we used to go to the park, and we used to go to the movies. And that was also a great thing.
Miss, do you remember approximately how old you were at this time when your family made the journey to Bucharest?
So it was 1945. I was 7 years old. And after living in this pension, we had a room in somebody's house. We were recommended by this lady to another lady who had been the lady in waiting to the Queen of Romania, but also she had hit hard times and she needed some income, so she rented out this room, and it was in a wonderful, beautiful neighborhood. And later on, we actually rented an apartment in that neighborhood, just like a street away from where we had been. And it was a completely different life in Bucharest. It was a big city, it's the capital, and there were streetcars and some cars. My aunt got some kind of an agoraphobia. She was afraid to cross the street, I guess as a result of, everything else that happened. And so my grandmother, my aunt, and my uncle, who had come with us when we came to Bucharest, went back to the town where they used to live. But we stayed in Bucharest. We never went back. My father sold the business, and so he had money to start another business in Bucharest. And he had heard how all his family died, with one exception, the sister who was a pharmacist. So he was hoping that somehow, sometime, the sister was alive, and he was going to find her. And he, based on this hope, really, he decided to start another business, which was a pharmaceutical company, a small manufacturing pharmaceutical company. Temporarily, he took a partner who was a pharmacist, and the company did very well, but the sister never came back. And it was time for me to go to school. I was 7 years old. And I was sent to a French school where nobody spoke anything but French from day one. So that was a little bit of a challenge. And they had no remedial courses for anybody. I don't know, some of the children who were there had governesses, French governesses, so they were at a disadvantage. So it was a bit of a struggle, in the beginning especially. But eventually I learned French the hard way. And then what happened, because I had such an isolated life as a child, I had not been exposed to any kind of childhood diseases that you get vaccinated for these days. So my first 2 years in school, I was sick with everything, one thing after the other. I even had certain, like scarlet fever, which they said you were supposed to have only once. I had it twice, so I had everything in the world. And, with scarlet fever, once I was hospitalized because it was contagious, and there were no antibiotics. So eventually I got well after all this, but the good part of being sick so much, there was a good part. Not that I missed school. That was not a good part. I wasn't happy about that. But I really started reading. And I started reading from the age 8. I read even novels. I read everything that came into my hands in every language that I could read in. So that was a very good thing. And we had a very good life, very good financially, between 1945 and 1948. So I was rich for 3 years, then that was it. Before that, it wasn't, and after that, not. In 1948, what happened, Romania had a democratic government right after the war. But little by little, the communists, who had some representation from the very beginning, they took over. So we ended up by 1948, there was a communist government. So what they did, the peasants took the land from the landlords, and all industry was nationalized. So my father's business was just taken by the state. One day the workers came with a paper, and they said, sign the business over to the people. And he said, I'm not signing. And they said, you're not going home. So he was there for a while, and finally he had to sign. There was no choice. So he signed the business over, and that was the end of good times, really. We stayed in the apartment, in the nice apartment where we lived, until I left. We were still, until my mother and my brother left also. But otherwise, it was very hard. Luckily, my father was such a good accountant that he managed to get a job as a chief accountant, some different jobs, as an inspector, then as a chief accountant in a very important state-owned civil engineering military outfit. So the French school was closed, and 3 years, and that was it. That was all the education I got there. I was transferred to a state school, a neighboring school, about 2 minutes away from the house. I came in knowing a lot more than the kids in public school, which was useful. And all the French teachers left except for one. They were all French. They all went back to France, except for one who was married to a Romanian man. And this was my luck. She lived on the same street where we lived. And I took French lessons for I don't know how many years. So our financial situation was so bad that sometimes we couldn't make ends meet. And, mostly we got by. The food was just, mostly potatoes and bread, rarely meat. And it was tough times. So my father, after they took the business, my father was taken to prison. You wonder why? Because he was a capitalist, so-called capitalist, and they found some excuse. They took him to prison. He was in prison, and in the Romanian system during the communists, you were guilty as accused. They did not have to prove your guilt. You had to prove your innocence. So that's how things worked. And he, somehow or other, I don't know, a lawyer, finally, after about 6 weeks of prison, he was let out. Okay, he went back. He went to work. Well, there was a second time when he was in prison, when he was the chief accountant of this important construction company. Somebody stole a set of tires, these big tires that they use on construction machinery. They didn't know who stole them, so they took the entire management, chief accountant, chief engineer, director, chief of human resources. Everybody went to prison. And now it was their job to prove that they didn't take anything. And that was very disturbing, because they said that he owed something like 2 million, it was a ridiculous amount. They figured out how much revenue the 2 tires would have brought. It was completely Kafkaesque situation. So anyway, somehow or other, they found the guy who stole them, and so they let all these other people go. But this was more serious than the first time. He was sent to a prison in a different town. I went to visit him. I was about 15 years old. I went with the other wives, and he was behind bars, literally. Behind bars, and he looked very pale. And but my father always said that everything was fine. The first time, everything was fine, I'll get out. Second time, everything's fine, we didn't do anything, we will get out. The guards were very nice to them. And he actually eventually got out. He was very lucky that he was not a political prisoner who were treated differently, and most of them never even came back. So the communist Romania had all sorts of ideas about what next projects to complete. At some point they wanted to build a canal between the Danube and the Black Sea. So that's the southern part of Romania. And they had the political prisoners working on digging this canal. And I met somebody who actually worked there, and they worked in so much mud that they couldn't walk. The tunnel was so low they couldn't stand. So they made these sleds. Everybody was on their belly digging. And there were mosquitoes. The project was never completed. It was a very bad idea altogether. This area is ecologically a treasure, even to this day, now that they left it alone. So they destroyed that for several years. And nothing came of it except that they killed a lot of people.
The second time your dad was imprisoned, how long was he there?
It seemed like a really long time. It was probably 2 months or more, or longer. So the prison for him, it wasn't, the guards were nice. At some point somebody asked, who can count well? And others said, oh, he can count, pointing to my father, who wasn't accounted. So they had him clean toilets. They were nice. And when they went to court for their case, there were some political prisoners there. And they said they didn't have anything to eat for several days. So all these other prisoners had crumbs in their pockets, and they all took out the crumbs for these people to eat. It was really unthinkable. I can say that probably because I was older and much more aware of what was going on, communism was even worse than, from our point of view, than World War II.
From your memories, what was the attitude of the non-Jewish population towards the Jewish population in Bucharest at that time under communism rule?
So there was always anti-Semitism. Romanians, there were some who were anti-Semites, most who were anti-Semites perhaps, but I had Romanian friends, and there was no... in school, I was with Romanian children. Very few were Jewish, and we were not persecuted. However, the official attitude was that, Jewish people have equal rights, religion, free religion, everything, but we don't like the Zionists. Israel is bad. It's a capitalist country, whatever. So that was the attitude. A lot of Jews changed their names to make them more Romanian sounding, because there was discrimination. We never changed our name, even though it was unpronounceable for Romanians. The first time I heard my name pronounced right was when we left and we went to Austria. at the border when they read my name. It was perfect.
Yeah. And I know you mentioned you were in this French school until about 1948, and you were probably about 10 years old when that closed.
Yes.
Did you go to school after that time? Like you said the local school,
Yes.
neighborhood school?
Yes.
Okay. And did that go up until high school?
Yes. There were 10 years of school in Romania. So after the 10th grade, you were finished.
Okay. Okay. And so your teenage years, you were in school. Did you have particular experiences or memories from those teenage years in school that stick out to you?
So I was a very good student, and Romanian education was good in sciences and math. Otherwise, they were rewriting history, they were rewriting geography, they were rewriting everything. So, they were biased against the previous regime, and also it was very limiting. We learned mostly Romanian literature, not mostly, only Romanian literature, Romanian history, geography. You had to learn other countries too. And even the books that were printed, they were only printing Romanian books and Russian literature, which actually was very good, but Soviet literature as well. You couldn't find any foreign books. So what people did was everybody had a library at home, and we would borrow books from one another. And that's how I managed to read a lot.
Did you have any favorite novels during that time, like as a teenager? Any favorite books?
So I don't know if my taste was the same as it is now, because I read a lot of novels. I read Dickens and Victor Hugo, and also more modern, Erich Maria Remarque, for example, Hungarian writers. So the stories that I liked were novels, where there was a love story at the center, and all sorts of things happening, and then everybody lived happily ever after. I like that. I can't say whether I liked a specific book much more than others, but I just like to read a lot.
Mm-hmm. Did you learn Russian? Did you ever learn how to read?
Well, yes, we had
Russian
10
school?
years of Russian. And I was very good in Russian, too. I can barely remember how to read because we did not want to learn Russian. And there was never any conversational language taught. For example, except for the French school. English was my second language. In high school, we could pick a second language. I picked English. But the teachers had never been in England or any English-speaking country, so they learned from somebody who learned, and I'm sure they didn't speak well either. But they taught a lot of grammar. So I came here after learning a lot of grammar, barely knowing how to speak, but, having an idea about the language, which was a good thing after all.
And did your family and you stay in Bucharest
Yes.
after you finished high school?
Yeah, we stayed the whole time, yes.
Okay, all right. How long, do you recall which year you ended up leaving Bucharest?
Yes, so I left in either late 1960 or 61.
Okay.
I'm not sure of the year. But the way leaving Romania worked, like everything else, it was absurd. There was an apartment shortage. So if you had a nice apartment, the state wanted the apartment, so they came to visit apartments. And if you had a nice apartment, you had a better chance to leave. So what happened with the application process for immigration, we had applied, I don't know when, like I said, my whole life I waited to leave. But at some point, they said, okay, whoever wants to leave for the reunification of the family, it was called, should come to the police and fill out a petition and the forms, and they will be considered as people to leave. In truth, what happened, that Jewish organizations paid for everybody. They basically bought us. And the price depended on the person's age, qualifications. So at first, it was good business for Romania to send all the old people to Israel. They sent the old people who now they didn't have to pay any pensions, and they got rid of old people, no medical, nothing, right? But then, of course, everybody noticed that this wasn't right, so they started sending young people, working age people. So they came to see our apartment, and like I said, we lived in a nice place and had a nice apartment. And at the time, I already knew my husband. We had been friends for several years, and we had become romantically involved. So when they looked at my apartment, I knew that my family was going to leave pretty soon. So we sat down and we decided that rather than being separated, we never knew when his family was going to leave, rather than being separated, and in order to have a better chance to leave, we would get married. So we got married in a hurry. What happened, after people deposited these petitions to leave the country, their names were taken down, and they immediately lost their jobs. It worked very quickly. And whoever was in college got kicked out of college, which is what happened to my husband. He was a few months away from his engineering degree. He was already in fifth year, the second half of the fifth year, when he was just working on a project for his degree. So he was kicked out of college. However, I was maybe on another list, I don't know, but they didn't know about me. So I kept going to college until we got approved to leave. And nobody knew, and we didn't want to tell anybody that we were married because I didn't want to be associated with a dangerous element like him, officially. And so we were married in secret, except for our families. We didn't tell anybody. We went to the city hall to get married. We had a civil marriage. We were very young, 21, 22, and we went there. We didn't know what we needed. You needed to have some medical certificates. We got the medical certificates. We went to the town city hall, and they said, "Where are your witnesses?" We didn't have any witnesses even. So we grabbed a couple of people from the waiting room and paid them a little something, and they were the witnesses. Never saw them since. And we got married. It was official. Fine. So we kept this secret and hiding from everybody, including our friends, because we didn't want anybody to know. So what happened next?
What year was this, Agnes? What year did you get
I got married on January 7, 1960. Okay. So the next thing that happened was nothing, in my case. But they came to see his apartment, and his apartment was something else. So right away, somebody very, very important wanted that apartment, and they gave us a guy from the security, state security, with a black limousine, and they took us to all the places where we had to file the documents. And what other people, it took them months to go through this whole bureaucratic process, took us barely enough time to, like 2 weeks, by the time we woke up. And the irony is that they took your apartment, but you had to leave it immaculate and freshly painted. So that was the other thing, that they took it, but you had to paint it. Anyway, we didn't care. We were not allowed to take anything other than a suitcase with personal clothing, no papers, just a suitcase, and then a trunk, a small trunk, with household items, so like a duvet we took, dishes. But it was pretty small. So, and again, no paper. I wrapped everything in towels. Anyway, we were all packed, no jewelry whatsoever except a wedding band. What else? We are not allowed. We were not allowed anything. Just no money. We just left. So the rumors were that if you bought salami, there's a Hungarian salami. This was the rumor. Hungarian salami and a kind of liqueur, a very strong plum liqueur, you could sell those, once you got out of Romania. And we left based on my husband's approval to leave. And the affidavit for that family came from my mother-in-law's distant cousin in Brazil, which she hadn't seen in years. The other thing was that when they looked at his apartment and they saw who the people living there were, I was not on the list. So they said, she can't leave. My mother-in-law was, thinking on her feet, and she said, we're not leaving without her. And that did it, so I left with them. And the place we went was the first place. We went to Vienna. So we went to Vienna, and of course we couldn't sell the salami, we couldn't sell the liqueur, the plum brandy. So we were left with all this salami. We ate, we didn't have money, we ate a lot of salami. I have not touched that salami since then. It's been years. So we got to Vienna, where my mother-in-law was from a different part of Romania, and my father-in-law also. They were from Moldova, and my mother-in-law was from Chernovitz. She really considered herself Austrian. This was a part of the country that changed hands. So my mother-in-law, her native language was German, and my father-in-law had studied in Germany, had studied engineering in Germany. And my mother-in-law studied at the Vienna Conservatory. She was a pianist. All these, I'm going a little back in time because I remembered, all these came in very handy when nobody had a job and they were kicked out of college, because since they all knew how to play an instrument pretty well, my husband was hired to install antennas, TV antennas, on the roof. It was a new thing in Romania, TVs. So the they were sloped roofs, but he was very good. He had spent his vacations in the mountains, so he was good with the ropes. And anyway, so he did that, and then they played with the Romanian radio orchestra, so that brought him some income. In fact, they hired him to this roofing antenna company because he could play the violin, and different companies in Romania had different orchestras, and then there were competitions. So this is how this worked. So when we got to Vienna, my mother-in-law had cousins there, and my father-in-law in Romania was the head of I don't know if I should say the name or not, of a company, let's say, a German-Austrian company dealing with electrical and electronics things. And he still knew some people, so he got in touch with them. And he was immediately hired, my husband was hired, and I was hired. Now, I had never worked before, and I was not finished with my college education. I was in my 4th year. But I knew already pretty much in general, and I could always draw very nicely. So I was hired as a draftsperson, and they were hired as engineers. The thing with Austria was they had the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, and all the refugees from Hungary came to Vienna or Austria, and they had enough of refugees. They didn't want any. They made it impossible for people to stay there in Austria, where we wanted to stay, or in Europe, any place. Nobody wanted us. Nobody wanted refugees. Goodbye. So the Jewish organization gave us some money, and we were supposed to go to Israel, but my in-laws said that they were too old and it would be too hard. Life would be too hard for them in Israel. They didn't know the language. It was very hot. They couldn't work anymore. So then we had the option of either coming to the United States, going to Canada, or going to Australia. And as hard as we tried, we could not stay in Austria. So we opted for the United States, and from then on, the IRC, International Rescue Committee, was the organization that sponsored us, and we got a small sum of money, which added to the little bit that we worked, was enough sort of to get by in Vienna. So I had a very interesting year in Vienna. And I worked with this guy, because I didn't speak any German, they gave me a guy to work with who spoke some French. We got along very well. And the concerts and the opera, you could go for free or for little, like the price of a bus ticket, for nothing practically. So we went and we stood at the opera in the last tier, and it was the same music. We enjoyed it, and actually the people who really knew music and they were there with the score were the ones who went all the way upstairs. And so we went to concerts, we did a little bit of traveling. Vienna has beautiful surroundings, hills. We went hiking in the hills. We traveled a little bit, as much as we could. And Vienna itself is a beautiful city and has a lot of history. So this was nice, and we were all set to come to the United States. But what happened, my husband was worked actually at work. He worked with a man who was connected with officials. We don't know exactly how or what. He was connected with different officials, and he worked on our stay in Vienna. So I was already packing to leave and was still going to work, and he found out that maybe we could stay. There was a chance that we could stay. Meantime, at work, my friend, the French-speaking guy, we've gotten friendly working side by side, and he told me things, personal things as well. And he told me this story that he had worked for an American outfit, let's say, and they were interrogating not interrogating, that's the wrong word. They were interviewing the Hungarians who came out of Hungary to find out where various strategic points, important factories, hydroelectric works were. And he being a draftsman, he and another draftsman, they would draw these things as described and place them on maps. And so apparently this thing was winding down. The Hungarian Revolution was in the past. And everybody had left except for the two bosses. And the two bosses were Jewish. So one day my guy was talking to his colleague and saying something funny is going on here and I don't like it, and I hope all these Jews had died in concentration camps. And he's telling me the story, right? And I'm listening. I always listen to the end of everybody's story. So he told me this, and his co-worker had a different opinion. Immediately he went to the bosses and told them. And my friend found himself on the street within minutes. Check in hand, goodbye. And it was such a shock. I don't know if it was the shock, but he got vertigo. He wasn't able to get out of bed for 6 weeks. But when this happened, we were hesitating about, should we stay? Should we go? I went back home, not home, wherever we stayed. And I said, I'm not staying in this country. I don't want my children to grow up in this atmosphere. So we decided to come here.
And how long did you live in Vienna?
A year.
1 year.
We had a great time. I mean, we were young, and it didn't matter. We didn't have money, so what?
Why did you and your husband and in-laws feel like you wanted to leave Bucharest in the first place to go to Vienna? What were the reasons?
Well, while under the communist regime, everybody, or all my acquaintances and friends, and all the Jewish people, I could say, everybody thought of one thing: how to leave, how to get to the other side of the Iron Curtain, how to get to be free. So that's why everybody who could applied to leave. And that was our goal, to leave. And I know people, I know my friends, the guys, discussing how to swim over the Danube, for example. And I actually met somebody who did that and managed to get to Yugoslavia. The goal was Yugoslavia, which was a relatively freer, semi-communist country, had a special situation. So all we wanted when we lived there was to leave. So we left, there was no question. We left everything behind: furniture, carpets, jewelry, everything. Sold for nothing, really. My mother-in-law had a Bechstein piano, so just sold for nothing. So we left. It didn't matter what we could take with us. It meant nothing. And my father actually always said that the only thing you really have is up here in your head. Which is true.
Did your parents and brothers stay behind? Did they continue to live in Bucharest?
My parents were divorced by then. So my brother and my mother left and ended up in Israel. And my mother had a sister there, and eventually they were joined by her brother and his family. And my brother was a teenager at the time. He lived on a kibbutz. He was a soldier in the Israeli army. He was in two wars. And so he he was trying to continue his studies while working, while having a family, while being called in the reserves. So for all these reasons, he decided to come here. And we sponsored him, and he came here and brought his family. His wife is a Sabra, and their children, two of their children were born in Israel, and one was born here.
And when you say here,
Here in the States.
where is here?
Here is in the States.
So you were in Vienna for 1 year.
Yes.
And came to the United States. What year was that?
So I think it was 61, something like that, yeah.
And you came with your husband and mother and father-in-law at that time?
Yes. So the IRC or the Joint, or I don't know exactly who gave the money, they put us up first in a hotel in that time. It was near Columbia University, 112th Street. In New York, and we lived there for a while, quite a while. Then when we got jobs, we moved all in together to an apartment in Washington Heights. And then my husband and I, of course, we moved to this building where I've lived since then, changing apartments, but we lived here since then.
And where do you live now?
So I live in Riverdale, which is right on the Hudson River. My apartment is overlooking the Palisades Parkway, and it's a beautiful view, and always loved it, never got tired of it. And I have a huge terrace.
Beautiful. What were some of your first experiences and reactions as a newly arrived refugee in the United States?
So my first reaction was that here everything was upside down. Just to give a slight example, in Europe people go to work however dressed they are, as long as it's decent enough, but on Sundays, on weekends, they dress up. Here, it's just the reverse. The food was a surprise, especially the bread, which tasted like cotton. So that wasn't a good surprise. The supermarkets were amazing. The abundance of food. Already in Vienna, we had a little bit of a taste of good food, of course. But here it was another thing, so something to get used to. We did not have a lot of money in the beginning at all. So we had enough money to eat, but not enough money to take the subway sometimes. So we walked a lot. Anyway, we like to walk. And the first thing when we landed in this hotel, it was near Broadway. So we went out to Broadway and we said, okay, let's explore this street, Broadway. Let's walk to the end of it. So this was 112th Street, and we kept walking and walking until we got, I don't know if we got to around 60th Street or something like that. We said, that's a long street. Yes.
Were you and your husband able to find work when you got here?
I found work first, and I was fired from my first two jobs. Actually fired, not laid off, fired, and I'll tell you how. And then he found work. He was not fired. So the first job, my first job, was provided by, I think it was Joint. They had an agency. The Jewish organization had an agency to provide jobs. And they told me this is a temporary job. But I didn't know temporary, what is that even? So I took this job, and it was the owner was actually, he spoke Hungarian. It was a very small company. I didn't know, small company, big company, didn't know anything. There were maybe, I don't know, 4 people and a secretary. So I worked, and they gave me a drawing to do, and I didn't know English very well, so I didn't want to ask too many questions, and I didn't even understand completely what I was told. I usually said yes and then watched the reaction of the other person and changed it to no sometimes. So I worked there for 2 weeks, and I produced a drawing, almost finished. And now I laugh about the drawing. It was a site plan with piping and manholes and whatever, but I didn't know what was what, so I showed all the benches. They were there. I drew them in the site plan, which wasn't important at all. I left out the manholes. Anyway, but it was a nice-looking drawing, and I stepped away from my desk. The secretary came at that moment, and when I came back, she said, "I am so sorry. I fell on your drawing and I ripped it." So here was 2 weeks worth of work, and the secretary, who had been there a long time, seemed to be on friendly terms with the boss. Am I going to go and complain about her? Am I going to say anything? So while I was debating this dilemma, the boss called me in, and he said, "I am sorry, this is not working out. You're too slow." Now I had to start the whole thing all over, and he said, "You're too slow," because there's nothing to be seen from the 2 weeks. So that was that was my temporary job. I found out later, when I ran into other immigrants who had all passed through this company, and they said that the guy hired immigrants to have a tax deduction. So that's why it didn't last very long.
Yeah.
So then I had a better job, with another engineering company, and I started to feel quite at home there, and I was doing very well. Interestingly enough, the person I ended up working with was German. A very nice man. He was like a father to me. He had, I don't know how many daughters. He practically adopted me. And he liked me for having all the good German attributes. Again, we talked, and he said my name is not whatever his name was, but I changed my name when I came here. Okay? Later, he told me that he had a factory, an ammunition factory in Germany. And he employed a lot of concentration camp prisoners. But the guy saw himself like another Schindler, except that whatever he produced, as opposed to Schindler's factory, was good to use, So, but he had such a different point of view, when it came to the war. In his mind, this was unavoidable for Germany because they got such a bad deal after World War I that they had to do this. The economy was bad, this, that. It was a necessity in his mind, and it was so interesting. I have to add that my father never hated the Germans. He felt that this could happen to ordinary people, and we actually saw it happening during communism too. You had to keep a low profile, you had to do what you were told to do, you had to go to meetings, you had to participate. To go to the university, you had to join the youth organization. I could not have gone to the university without lying about my background, because the way it was free. 60% workers, 30% peasants, and 10% middle class. That's how the things were. And I was lucky I had been a good student in high school, that I got into college without an exam, and we lied when we filled out the papers. And we said that my father was always an employee. They didn't have what we have now, databases. So, yeah, so that was interesting. Anyway, to get back to that job, the man taught me a lot of things. I really owe him a lot. And I learned pretty good English while I was working there. Now, what happened in this company, the original owners were dead. They were very good engineers, 3 of them. And the sons who inherited the company, some were nicer, some were smarter. The principal of the company happened to be neither nice nor smart. Didn't do anything all day. Sat with his feet on the desk and read the New York Times. He had an organizational chart on the wall showing himself at the top. So it so happens that another Romanian girl started working there, and we became very good friends. We happened to live nearby, and she had a tragic story. Her husband had died, and very young, very young. She came with her in-laws. Anyway, we were friends, and we were talking one day. Officially, we had a lunch hour of half hour, and we had 2 coffee breaks, one in the morning, one in the afternoon, officially 10 minutes, okay? So during those 10 minutes, she came to talk to me, and she was telling me that she had another job offer, but she didn't feel like leaving because this was, you know, a nice place to work for, and I was there, and she felt very comfortable here. And the principal of the company walked by. This was around Christmas. He walked by, he must have been drunk too, because he said, you know, the break is over. My friend didn't say anything. I said, not, you know, knowing English, but not enough English to know the difference between the subtleties of the language. I said, oh yeah? And because of this oh yeah, which I meant to say, I am sorry, I didn't know, but it came out as oh yeah, he went to the chief of personnel, and we both got fired right away. Oh. So everybody was very sorry to see us go. There was really no reason. And, well, my friend, of course, accepted the job that she was offered. I got a better paid job, which is sometimes what happens when you get fired or laid off. And that was the end of my adventures. Then the jobs I had were, I worked for nice places. One of the companies I worked for 23 years. So, yeah.
What was your profession there?
I was a mechanical designer. So in the beginning, we did manual drafting and design, calculations. But then when everything got computerized, I learned AutoCAD very well. And we worked on AutoCAD, and the design part also, we had different programs to design. I worked on air conditioning systems. And the company that I worked for a long time, 23 years, did a lot of international work too. They did a lot of airports. I worked on a lot of airports and hydroelectric central in Pakistan. Very interesting projects. And the people were very nice, and it was conveniently located close to Grand Central on 42nd Street.
Made your commute easier.
It made my commute easier, yes.
And when you were in New York, Did you and your husband, did you have any children during this time when you arrived and were
Right.
working?
So the first 10 years we didn't have children. And, being out, it was just such a relief. And we were so eager to see Europe, to travel, to go. And we did. We were working, we took 5 months off. Everybody said we were crazy. And all the money that we had saved, we spent it on traveling for 5 months. We had an open airline ticket, so you could go from one place to another. It was included in the price of this ticket, and we stayed. It was much cheaper in those days. We stayed in cheap places, and we ate in cheap places. We had a wonderful time, and we saw. We didn't go to the northern countries because we liked the warm weather, but we went to England, Holland, France, Spain, Portugal, Greece, Switzerland, Italy, and Israel.
And what year was this, Agnes?
This was before my children were born. So my first child was born in 1970. So this was actually 1968. I remember the year because we almost went to Prague, but then there was the Prague Spring, so we decided not to take any chances.
That sounds like a lovely trip.
It was a lovely
say
trip.
the least.
I am not sorry that we spent the money on this.
And so you said your first child in 1970?
70, yes. So
Yeah.
both my children
And
were
what-
born here, 1970 and 1971, my second child. Very fast, one after the other.
What are their names?
So my oldest daughter is Nadia Lee. This Lee is her middle name. And my youngest daughter is Jill, and her middle name is Danielle.
And where do they live now?
My youngest daughter, Jill, lives in Los Angeles. After college, she spent 2 years in Prague, ironically, just where we didn't go, teaching English. And I had to drag her back from there because, I was afraid. All my life I tried to get out of Eastern Europe, and she goes back now. But eventually she came back, and she settled in LA. And my oldest daughter, who used to live in Brooklyn and loved it, got married and moved to Stamford, Connecticut, which isn't too far.
Yeah. How did you choose your daughter's names?
So both my children were premature, and I was unprepared. But Nadia was suggested by my mother, and Lee was a version of Leah, which is the Jewish name. And after Nadia, and everybody in the park asking me, Nadia, well, how do you pronounce it? I said, enough with the complicated names. So I named Jill, and nobody had any questions about that. And that was it.
When they were younger, what language or languages did you speak to them growing up?
We started speaking Romanian in the house. My husband and I spoke Romanian. And eventually they went to school and they learned English. I didn't want them to learn English from me and get my accent, God forbid. So they went to school, they learned English, and then they started answering in English. And by answering in English, we ended up by talking English all the time.
Yeah. Have you ever talked to them about your experiences surviving the Holocaust, surviving the war?
Yes.
Have you shared much with them?
I shared a lot with them. So everything I told you, They pretty much knew at a fairly young age. I am not sure, but my daughter Jill, she had to interview somebody for her schoolwork. She was in grammar school. She had to interview somebody, and of course I was right here, so she interviewed me. And when I told the story about the war, she took this to school, and the teacher cried. She came back telling me the teacher cried. So they knew very early, and my grandchildren, my daughter Jill has 2 sons, my grandchildren also know, and actually one of them was very interested in taking a video, and we started, but we never finished. We didn't have enough time, and then the part that he did somehow got lost. So this will be very good for them, all in one piece.
What are your grandchildren's names?
Liam is the oldest one, and Dylan is the youngest one. So it's Liam Jonah and Dylan Noah.
And how old are they?
The oldest one is 14 and the youngest one is 12.
Okay. And their dad, did he grow up in the United States?
No, their dad is British.
Oh, British.
So
Okay.
their last name is Hardy.
Have they been able to travel to the UK?
Yes, they go, quite often with their father for extended periods of time, vacations.
So it sounds like they're interested in hearing about your story. They know about it.
They're very interested in history.
Yeah.
And World War II and World War I, especially that time period. I think it also comes from seeing movies.
Are there things that you would like to share with them or kids of their generation in this moment, in our present day, given everything you have lived through and survived?
It's very difficult for me to come up with some kind of a wise sentence. But I would say that, it's a problem when we see the world as us and them. And you have to have an open mind. There is no us and them, really. We're all pretty much the same. When you travel, you realize how most average people have the same aspirations, and most of them are good but can do very bad things. And there is a danger in this polarization.
What would you say now in our present moment of the state of Israel and the conflict, for example, that's happening? How do you talk about that with your grandchildren, or what do you feel about what's happening right now in the Middle East?
So I have to say, without any doubt, Israel has the right to exist and has the right to defend itself. And it's very important for us. It was important to know that there was a place we could go to and be welcome, and not where nobody is anti-Semitic. It made all the difference in the world. We lived with the hope that someday we'll get out of Romania and go someplace where you can be free to be Jewish. And I thought that here in the United States would be like this, and I thought that there were no, or at least not many, anti-Semites. So this time period for me is very difficult, It's traumatic, and it brings back very bad memories. And having said this, I don't like, I think all wars, when you think back, all wars are so useless. You think between England and France there was a 100-year war. What happened after World War II? Former enemies are friends and allies. What was the whole thing about, right?
Would you say that surviving what you have throughout your life has impacted your faith, your religion, your identity in any way?
Definitely somebody's experience has an important part in forming their personality, and so it is undeniable. But what's also important is how you react to something. So the same experience might have a different impact on different people. So obviously, whatever my life was very important and left a mark. All the good things and the bad things. But the living through hard times makes you stronger. You don't feel entitled to anything. You feel you have to work for everything.
Have your experiences affected how you raised your daughters, or what you impart on your grandchildren?
So whatever I learned from my parents, as I said, from my mother, to be open, honest, hardworking, thorough, and from my father, I try to impart to my children. And what I learned from my father actually was not to be a pessimist, and to be independent, to manage in the world the way he managed in Romania. You really had to know how to work the system and everything. So I learned to be independent, and I learned to rely on my abilities to survive, to support myself. I never thought that I would be a housewife forever. I was home for 7.5 years after my children were born, but I had no intention to not go back to work.
How would you identify yourself now?
I would identify myself as American, as culturally Jewish, let's say. After the war, when we didn't have much to eat, we gave up the idea of being kosher, obviously. And then we kind of lost it. And so we celebrate the holidays, the major holidays, with family. My brother lives in New Jersey. We go out there or they come here. And my children were brought up in this spirit. So my children are not religious either. I taught them not to be prejudiced, so they're not. And I taught them to be what's called a mensch, but I don't know if you apply the term to girls too. I guess you can say that.
Have you ever returned back to your hometown, the country where you grew up? What is now the country that you grew up in?
Never. I never returned. My brother never returned. We didn't.
Yeah.
Chapter closed. Chapter closed. The girls wanted to go back. At some point I was thinking maybe, but then we never made it. So.
Yeah. Just a few more questions for you before we close. why did you feel so strongly to come forward and share your story with the USC Shoah Foundation?
It's a good question. I think it's natural when one gets older to sort of look back and wonder about the good things that you did, the mistakes that you made, your contribution to others, to society. So, without being like Einstein or something, all of us contribute to our immediate, the people who are surrounding us, right? And I thought that this was a very important thing for me to do, to tell my story, to let everybody know that, yes, the Holocaust happened. I lived through it. I lost my family. I saw terrible things afterwards, families destroyed. And most of the survivors went on to build new lives and have new families. And I think nowadays, when there is so much anti-Semitism, just to see that the Jews are not that different from everybody else is helpful. And that's about it. I think it was important for me to do this.
And we thank you for sharing your story. Is there anything else you would like to tell your grandchildren, future generations, given everything you've lived through in your life?
Well, I think everything I said is what I wanted to say. I don't think I left anything important out. And thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Agnes. I don't have anything else for right now. Todd?
Thank you. Bye. So here I am with my grandmother, my father's mother, who, as I said, had 11 children and 9 children survived. And I must be about 2 years old.
And where was it taken?
It was taken in Gerla, where my grandmother and my father's sisters lived. This is me. I am about 6 years old, very fashionable in a sailor suit. And it was taken by a professional photographer in Târnăveni. Here I am in Târnăveni having a very good time on a sled on a hill near our house.
And whereabouts are you?
In Târnăveni, about 6 years old. This is in Bucharest already after the war, so I am 7 years old. And it's my father and my mother in the picture. My father, I don't know, he looks a little bit not very happy. He didn't like to pose for anybody and anything. And my mother was very, very lovely. She looks very nice in this picture and very elegant. So this is me as a new American after I came to the United States, and so it's in New York.